Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control.
Just over a year ago, President Trump signed an executive order stating that the federal education bureaucracy is not working, and instructing Education Secretary Linda McMahon to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return education authority to the states, while continuing to ensure the effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits on which Americans rely. Keri Ingraham joins me today to discuss the actions taken since then to scale back the federal role in education. We also talk about the Education Freedom Tax Credit, Federal Scholarship Tax Credit, as we often refer to it on this podcast. 29 states have opted in. We talk about why all 50 states should participate. Keri Ingraham is a senior fellow at Discovery Institute and director of the Institute's American Center for Transforming Education. She's also a senior fellow at Independent Women. Dr. Ingraham is a former educator with extensive experience as a teacher, coach, and administrator. Keri Ingraham, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thanks. Delighted to be with you.
This season on Freedom to Learn, we're talking about what it means to free education from federal dominance and union control. It's been a little over a year since President Trump signed an executive order and instructed Secretary of Education Linda McMahon to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education. You and I were at the signing of that executive order last year. How did you envision returning education to the states at that point?
Well, first, let me start by saying it was such an honor that President Trump would invite us to be there, and a very historic day of saying we're not going to continue the status quo in this country of dumping astronomical amounts of money, heaping on bureaucracy, and really not improving student learning despite the spending, despite all of the personnel spending time day in and day out doing this. We are going to turn the ship. We are going to return this to the states. That's where it's intended for education to be controlled, state and local level. And I was so pleased for the secretary to be there and for President Trump to say, I'm calling on her to do everything lawful in her power to start dismantling this thing, just a bunch of bureaucracy. Now, while it's going to take the acts of Congress, the votes in Congress to fully eliminate the department, there's so much we saw just going into this that could be done. Now, fast forward a year later, I have been blown away by how much progress they have made. Linda McMahon, she is a businesswoman. She came in there knowing how to manage a huge organization with big dollar amounts, manage people, executive leadership. And the team that she built has been best in class. And from my high expectations and hopes of what would happen in this first year, they've just hit it out of the park more than I think anyone's imagined. And you're always going to have, those naysayers who are like, well, we're just moving around things. Nothing's really happened. Well, item by item, you can go through and see that they are saving money. They are empowering parents. They're freeing up states to innovate. They're putting education with labor, with other departments where it makes sense. So things aren't siloed anymore. So it is a new day. So fast forward a year later, I am so encouraged, and more is to come. They're truly just getting started and downsizing, right-sizing this thing.
Sometimes the discussions in the media, maybe also on social media, focus on the closing the Department of Education, the dismantling of the actual agency. But I think some of the things that you were mentioning were more about that bigger picture, returning education to the states, making things make sense and operate more efficiently. And you went through some of those steps that they've taken in a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. You said that the results are striking. They've overhauled operations, cutting nearly half its staff, reducing administrative layers, consolidating offices, streamlining grants, merging programs, et cetera, et cetera. From an outside the Beltway perspective, what does that look like to you?
I get to DC frequently from Washington State, where I'm based. Everything is these acronyms and it gets kind of technical and wonky. But basically what's happening is they're bringing down this federal footprint and saying, we don't need 4,400 employees pushing around paper. We can do this more efficiently, and there's going to be more accountability, more productivity by downsizing it. And so they've reduced the staff by 47%. which is enormous savings for taxpayers. And just a couple of weeks ago, they announced that they have a building, massive in DC, that's 70% empty. And so they're going to be relocating the Department of Education to a smaller building where it's going to save over $4.8 million per year for taxpayers. And that does a lot of things. So, what it does is it signals that they truly are bringing down the federal bureaucracy and returning this to the states, but also that's fiscally responsible. They realize that, we just can't continue to spend money and not see the ROI. And the secretary has been so clear on everything she's done that it's going to make sense for the education of children. It's going to empower parents, and it's financially got to be viable and make sense because it's taxpayer money that's being spent. And it's just one example of something that they've done incredibly well, as already in this first year, over 2 billion with a B, billion dollars was cut of money that was going to these radical ideologies that had nothing to do with teaching kids to read, write, do math, critical thinking. And so instead, that money can be spent where it really matters, block granting it to the states, inviting states to submit waivers from the bureaucracy. And that's where we're seeing the innovation. Really excited as more states are coming on and doing that, because every state is different and they're closer to these students and they know what their state needs as far as education, workforce development. And inviting those waivers is saying, we're returning this and we're doing it in a way where we're helping you. It's not overnight, just eliminating the department. Federal dollars aren't going away. All of that fear mongering about like we're cutting special education when our country downsizes this department. No, that is not happening. Special education programs for low income students, civil rights, all of those things predate actually the inception of this department. So those aren't going away. But what's going away is a lot of the micromanagement that's happening in DC, and it's been happening for 45 years. It's been a failed experiment and astronomically expensive. So much is happening. I'm really excited. One other thing I want to mention is the federal tax credit. And so that has already been codified by Congress. And while people say, oh, the Department of Education can't get involved with that, they're championing it. But that it was part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, empowering parents when they're stuck in a school that is not serving their child well.
I do think it's interesting, Keri, that you are here regularly for events and for policy discussions, but you are not of the Beltway. So you have a different perspective than a lot of our guests who are very much former bureaucrats, a lot of us, and maybe immerse ourselves too much in the technical aspects of things and lose sight of the bigger picture. You're also a former teacher and school administrator. And so you have that perspective that you bring as well as to like what's really needed in a classroom, what's really needed in a school. And I would imagine that perspective is not, hey, you know what we need? We need more layers of bureaucracy. Am I right on that?
Absolutely not. I spent the first 17 years of my career as a practitioner, as you mentioned. So, like boots in the ground in the school, first teacher, coach, then administrator in the traditional setting. Then I moved into non traditional, so hybrid schools, virtual. This is all before COVID. Just looking at how do we do education different than the one size fits all, because one size really fits none. And that's really foundational to why we move this thing back to the states and ultimately closer to parents and local decisions, because this huge, massive government control, it's not working. It has not improved student learning despite $3 trillion of spending and 45 years of just making it bigger and bigger and more just layers of paper, rules, regulations. And again, to get it closer to families, they know and love their children best. They need to be empowered as an ultimate decision maker. And when everything is controlled in Washington, D.C., that cannot happen and that cannot happen well. But also just to see when we get the federal out of the way and states are empowered, that's where accountability is going to come. When states are actually the ones that can't push the buck off and say, oh, our hands are tied, Washington, D.C. No, what states are going to rise up? And we see already those that are submitting these innovative waivers those leaps and bounds in their student learning are going to happen. And those states that just double down on these radical ideologies and misplaced priorities, that they're going to slip farther behind, and it's going to really force accountability. So that's a byproduct a lot of people aren't talking about, but a new day is coming. And I'm so grateful for Secretary McMahon, the entire team there at the Department of Education, who realize our job is to get out of the way and let those closer to the students be the experts.
We're skimming over a number of different things that they've done, and waivers for sure is something that already existed in federal education law. But this administration, as we've talked about in this season of the podcast, has opened up and really invited these, as you said, innovative waiver applications. So we have seen Iowa get theirs approved, and Indiana submitted one. I believe Arkansas has submitted one as well. And those will continue. And you've written about the consolidation of some of the programs between education and labor. From an outside Beltway perspective, what's your take on that?
I was super pleased to see it. And, across the board, that wasn't what some people thought. It's like education isn't about workforce development, it's about developing character. Yes. But as a country, we have to equip our future generation to be contributors. And part of that is exposing kids to the way that they're uniquely wired and they're created and where they have their interests and their gifts and their skills. And so, not operating education just in this silo, but linking it up with labor. And it didn't just blindly move over to labor. Some of the team from the Department of Education, who's experts in workforce development, moved over with it. And so, it's been a very thoughtful, planned decision. And these interagency agreements are simply just one federal agency contracting with another. So it's nothing radical. It's like nothing crazy. This has been happening for such a long time. But I mean, that's what you would do in a business if you run it well. You're going to see, where do I need personnel? Where's the expertise? Where should we overlap and not just do things in isolation? To, at the end of the day, be as fiscally responsible, to drive down costs, but increase quality. And that is so far missing in education. And so this administration is just bringing some common sense to, let's reorganize this thing as we downsize it. And so that at the end, we can have the very best outcome for our future generation. And so I was really pleased to see that happening. So instead of having two different grant portals that a state has to use, they've streamlined, they've moved that into one, they've made the process easier, the points of contact have been dialed down. And so there's not so much confusion, and states can really see what they need to do. They can submit it, and then they can get back to taking care of their state and focus on those children, on their education programs, instead of spending so much time dealing with this micromanagement process in Washington, D.C., which again is not educating children. It's not effective or efficient.
Something else that you mentioned was the opportunity to block grant funds. And that's something that would have to be introduced by Congress, as would codifying these IAAs. So I'm hearing a lot of what the department's doing, they're doing with the acknowledgement that it's the role of Congress to make these permanent. So the IAAs, this partnership between labor and education that you're talking about, they describe that as a proof of concept. Look, this makes sense. Look, this is working. Block granting, perhaps something that that Congress could take a look at as well. But I do want to acknowledge something else that you said, that the funding for Title I, funding for IDEA, students with disabilities, that's not being cut, nor could it be cut, because that's Congress's job. They set the appropriations level. So the $18 billion plus for Title I, that continues to flow. I think it's approaching $16 billion for IDEA, that continues to flow. And it doesn't matter where the bureaucrats sit or how they're arranged. As you said, those funding flows predate the department, and they will continue on as they are appropriated by Congress. We've talked about waivers, we've talked about IAAs, we've talked about opportunities for block granting. And you did mention that the remaining Department of Education staff plan to leave the headquarters at 400 Maryland Avenue and move to a new building. some people might think that that's not a big deal.
I would say those people that think, "Hey, this is no big deal," have not been to the Department of Education. So, you walk in that building, it is massive, and it's largely empty. I know riding up the elevator, they're like, "Oh, we don't use that floor, we don't use that floor. Oh, we're going up here, and we only use part of this floor." And it's like, this is taxpayer money.
Mm.
And so, yes, it's symbolic. It shows that we're not gonna have this massive federal footprint in education going forward. Just in the reduction of staff alone signals that. But what it also shows is that we're gonna do whatever we can to save taxpayer money, and we don't need a building that's 70% empty. And why don't we get in a place where it makes more sense, saves money? Historically, we've seen that, with the Biden administration through COVID, the building was even more empty because people didn't have to come to work. They weren't working. But there was no thought to cut it down or to save money. And so these common sense principle that the Trump administration is implementing across departments and now in education being no different is just so welcome to us as taxpayers to say thank you. Thank you for doing what makes sense and realizing like, as us Americans are trying to be good stewards of money, we want that from our government as well.
That building's not gonna sit empty. I think Department of Energy staff are gonna be moving in.
Yes, but then that adjusts the budget on all of these fronts.
Yeah.
So, with that, I would also just like bring back to this outstanding USA Today article that Secretary McMahon put out November 16th during the government shutdown, where she said, "Hey, look, we were closed for 43 days, the longest government shutdown at that point in history. And education didn't go away. Buses ran on time, athletics continued, teachers still taught, teachers got paid, students went to school seamlessly." So she made this point of like, it doesn't take this huge federal government control to make education work in our country. They really don't educate any students from the Department of Ed. And so that just signaled again, just like the or moving the building elsewhere smaller, that this is not where education happens in our country. It happens close to the students.
Right, and, basically 90% of funding for K-12 education is from the state and local level, only 10% or so is federal. It's the strings and the regulations and the time away from serving students that happens to serve the federal bureaucracy, that needs to be addressed, and in these various ways. How do you respond to union leaders and their political allies when they claim that the Department of Education must remain intact? Every bureaucrat must remain just where they are in their seat. What's your take on their talking points and your response?
It's nothing new. Anytime you're going to try to get education closer to parents and empower parents to be the ultimate decision maker in their child's education, the teacher unions lose their mind. Like they just come unraveled because they believe that their control, their power is the most important thing. It's not about families, it's not about children, it's not about their education. And so it is not surprising that they're coming completely unglued and this fear mongering that is not factual. The very first thing they did, I remember leaving that executive order signing ceremony, and the headlines were already Trump administration is cutting funding for special education. And that was a narrative for weeks. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. And they don't look at the facts. So, like you said, this predates the Department of Education. It can't be cut. But again, that just ran on loop for weeks from the teacher unions, their progressive political allies. And it's just this fear tactic that like education's going to go away again, to the point of like the longest government shutdown, education didn't even flinch. Nothing happened. Um, and so they're always going to fearmonger. Also, they're going to be against anything that isn't big government or central control because they want to get their hands as close to the purse strings as much money and as much control as possible. And, they fear that their political allies won't be able to influence their agendas
Mm.
if this is dialed down. So it's par for the course with them. But you know what we saw during COVID? That parents had a front row seat in their children's classrooms through those remote Zoom sessions. And the teacher union started to expose their agendas, and they've doubled down as more parents have exited the system and they've questioned and they've been exposed. And so the teacher unions are doing so much to help school choice and to cause this mass public school exodus, which is continuing. And so they are so far gone with their fearmongering, lack of facts, but also they're just exposing themselves that they're not about children and education.
Let's talk about school choice as a way to free families, free children from union dominance. And let's dig in a little bit into what we're now calling the Education Freedom Tax Credit. We were calling it the Federal Scholarship Tax Credit for a good long while, but okay, Education Freedom Tax Credit, that's okay as a name too. Remind our listeners what the tax credit does.
Yes. Well, on July 4th, Independence Day, President Trump signed into law the One Big Beautiful Bill. And a part of that bill is this tax credit that you're referencing. It's a first of its kind in our nation's history for a federal tax credit scholarship program for K 12 students. And taxpayers can donate as an individual up to $1,700 per year to a nonprofit scholarship granting organization that's qualified, and in turn, that taxpayer is going to get back a dollar for dollar federal tax credit. So it's a wash. You give money to help a child get an education scholarship. And at the end of the day, when you pay your taxes, it doesn't cost you a thing. There's no annual volume cap in how many Americans and the total that can be donated. It doesn't sunset over time. And so it's creating this new day where these claims that, oh, you're going to defund public education in our state, you're going to bankrupt our state by giving money to school choice, like all of those fall flat because this takes no money from state budgets. It doesn't take money from public schools. It's taxpayers who say, we recognize that moms and dads should be empowered. We want to give this. And it's a really easy yes for taxpayers, knowing they're going to get that full dollar for dollar match back in their federal tax return when they file. So really excited about that. Now, states do have to opt in. We already have 28 states who have opted in, and we're only in April. And this doesn't take effect until next January, January 1, 2027. So there is a lot of time. Several Democrats came out last year once this passed, and they were a hard no. We're not going to have anything to do with this because it came out of the Trump administration and because of the pressure of the teacher unions. Well, they're changing their mind and they're kind of retracting those. Now, have many Democrat governors signed on? No, not yet. But they're no longer coming out with this hard no. They're saying things like, I'm going to take a look at that. Or we're going to need to wait and see how the rules come out on this. Because they're recognizing that's going to be really hard politically to sell that we are preventing people in our state to donate to scholarships to children in our state. And we're going to let anyone in our state who donates only give to children in other states. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And I think they're seeing that is going to hurt them politically. And that's what matters to a lot of these lawmakers that aren't interested in the education of children. So really excited about this. But right now what needs to happen is we just need to educate everyday Americans what this is, those that don't follow all this education policy. Let them know it truly is a dollar for dollar and point them to great scholarship granting organizations. So starting in January of next year, they can contribute. And I would say look for a scholarship granting organization that has a good track record, that didn't just pop up last week or a couple months ago, but find an organization that's been doing this, they've been in the game, they know how to do it. And you can check and see that how much do they give actually to scholarships versus how much they spend on overhead. And so look for the one where your dollars are going to go the farthest to help kids.
Right. We had Children's Scholarship Fund on earlier this year, ACE scholarships. I regularly have folks from American Federation for Children on, and they have launched an SGO, a scholarship granting organization as well. So a lot of reputable organizations out there ready to help provide these scholarships for students. And it's not just the old-fashioned way of doing scholarships where the funds come in and then the scholarships go just to tuition. This is for a wide array of education expenses, including expenses that benefit public school students. So public school students could benefit from things like tutoring. And that's where those 22 governors that haven't opted in yet really need to rethink their position. They can't use the old fashioned, I don't want to support private school vouchers argument. That's not what this is.
Jenny, such a good point you make, that these are flexible. They can be used, yes, for private school tuition fees, but also things like transportation, tutoring, as you mentioned, which is hugely needed for all students. It can be used for a variety of like curriculum, educational technology.
I hear you saying that folks need to make sure that they're educating people in their communities, in their states, so that they know to redirect their tax dollars that they owe the IRS to a scholarship granting organization. They'll get credit for $1,700 a year of doing that. They also need to be educating their governors and state leaders who haven't opted in yet. And then they also need to be informing parents about it so that the parents are ready to apply for these scholarships. That's something that I worry about a little in our world of expanding education options, that there's so many options, but are we making sure that parents know about them and that they know which portal to go to and how to navigate? Because it can be overwhelming. I'd love for you to talk about a recent piece that you wrote where you did a really great job citing some evidence of the benefits of school choice and some studies. I just want people to be aware of that if they're like, wait, is there any proof that school choice works? Yes, there is. And Keri's written about it. So you've written that school choice has demonstrated consistent, measurable effects. Do you want to share some of the data, some of the evidence of that you've seen?
Absolutely. Well, just at a high level, not to get too wonky for your listeners, but school choice, what we see is that it is the most effective way to improve education for children academically, for those who exit, as well as for children who remain. So, like, yes, you heard that right. When school choice is in a community, that principle of competition increases the quality of the public schools. Now, this may not happen overnight. This may not happen if you just have like 5 families leave. But when there's true market competition, and, there's a period of time like we've seen in Florida, is a great example because they've had this tax credit scholarship for decades now. And we see that that truly does increase the learning of those public school kids who remain, because public schools realize we're going to continue to lose kids if we don't do a better job. And so, school choice, I believe, is the fastest, most effective way to improve education in our country for every single child in all of the sectors. Competition works. Free market principles increases quality, drives down costs, and spurs innovation. And what's more needed in our education world than those three things today? So that is one outcome that these studies are showing, is the academics go up for all children. But beyond that, when a child has access to school choice in a variety of states, we've seen data that consistently shows they have higher graduation rates of high school as well as college. And so these new environments, when it's a different school culture or different expectations, really do produce some lifelong persistence that we see as it takes to get through college for a student, and also gives them great preparation for life, those life skills when they're being challenged and their heart and mind is being cultivated. And unfortunately, in the majority of our public schools today, they're being taught things like an anti American worldview, and they're being taught to be an activist. Why is class time with taxpayer money being spent to have children protest, to take to the streets on things they know nothing about? They can't read, they can't write, they don't know basic reasoning, but they're being indoctrinated in these one political ideologies that, again, have nothing to do with preparing them to be successful in life. They're not going to be full time protesters. And so, what we're seeing in school choice, some of these benefits and the studies are showing, is it's better character outcome, workforce development, and life preparation. And so, across the board, school choice makes sense. And it's also fiscally a good move for a state. So instead of giving, X dollars of funding to the public school through a lot of these programs like education savings account, private school scholarships, that family only gets a portion of their child's state funding that would be given to the public school. And so it creates enormous savings for the state. So to me, school choice makes all kinds of sense. And I'm so grateful that this administration recognizes that and they're taking steps to make that a reality.
Right. And certainly we want to acknowledge that states are recognizing that and expanding school choice and education freedom at the state level. Is there a school choice myth that really bothers you that you'd want to dispel today as we conclude?
Every single one, absolutely. So I touched on this idea that, it's going to bankrupt a state. It's going to take money from public school children and harm them. And that's simply not the case because school choice benefits all kids, even those who remain. But I think one of the myths that is really important that we just expose is that educators are not the expert of children. It is parents, it's moms and dads who know and love their children best. They're going to be there far past the school day, far past the school year when those teachers come and go. And when a parent drops their child off at school or puts them on the bus, they don't lose their parental rights, and they are the best and the first educator of their children. And so this myth that parents, you don't have what it takes or you didn't have enough education to educate your child, that is simply not true. Again, parents know and love their child best, and they've got to be the ones making the decision. And so this myth that school choice, parents are going to know what to pick, I just say, that has got to come down. We have got to destroy that myth because nobody knows better for their child than moms and dads.
Well, Keri, thank you for your support for education freedom, for parental rights, and for common sense education policies. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
My pleasure, Jenny. Thanks so much.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.